Hello, this is Heather Meeker. This narrated presentation is part of a series on open source software licensing. I'm a lawyer and venture capitalist who specializes in open source software licensing. This presentation is about compatibility in open source licensing. Open source licenses can be compatible with each other or not. If you are looking at this presentation, you probably want to know how to combine code from various sources into a single open source project. Compatibility rests on a key concept about open source software licensing, which is that it is a direct licensing model. When more than one open source component is combined into a program, the rights in that program come directly from each contributor to the end recipient. That works fine as long as the license for each contribution is compatible with all the others. Of course, that is easiest if all the contributors are using the same license. Compatibility problems happen when contributions are under different licenses that are not compatible. First, let's look at an example of compatibility that works. In this diagram, some contributions are under Apache 2, and some are under GPL 3, and some are under MIT or other GPL-compatible licenses. All those elements can be combined into one program without violating any of the licenses. Here is another case that works. All of the licenses here are library copyleft or weak copyleft licenses, so code under them can be combined into one program. The recipient gets rights under each of those licenses simultaneously for each part. But some licenses, notably GPL, have rules about combining code under other licenses in the same program. GPL, for example, requires all code in the same program to be under GPL or a GPL-compatible license. Some open source licenses are not compatible with GPL. Here is an example that does not work, mainly because other copyleft licenses, like Eclipse Public License and CDDL, impose different conditions from GPL. Here are a few principles of compatibility. The first one is that CC0, which is a public domain dedication, BSD and MIT are compatible with everything. That's because permissive licenses have very few conditions. They only require notices on distribution, and public domain dedications impose no conditions at all. The next rule is that Apache 2.0 is compatible with everything but GPL 2 and LGPL 2.1. This rule is a little controversial, and the reasons for it are a little complicated, but they basically have to do with the fact that Apache 2.0 contains certain patent provisions that are inconsistent with those of GPL version 2 and LGPL version 2, which have no patent grants in them. This compatibility issue mainly matters for Linux because the Linux kernel is under GPL version 2 only, and that means that Apache 2 code can't go in the kernel. However, most code that is under GPL 2, if you look at it carefully, is really under something called GPL 2+. That means GPL 2 or any later version. The GPL has a provision in it that says that code can be available under any later version unless the author says otherwise. Apache 2.0 is compatible with the version 3 licenses, GPL 3 and LGPL 3. It's only a problem with the version 2 licenses. The next rule is that LGPL is compatible with the equivalent version of GPL. And that's true because LGPL specifically says so. And therefore, LGPL 2.1 is compatible with GPL 2. Those are the equivalent versions. And LGPL 3 is compatible with GPL 3. Of course, again, the compatibility is usually only a problem if the author has selected LGPL 2.1 only. Then the code would be compatible only with GPL2 and not LGPL3 or GPL3. The next rule is that most copyleft licenses are not compatible with each other. That's because most copyleft licenses say that you cannot use the code in any way that imposes an additional condition on using the code. And copyleft licenses all have their own conditions. However, Mozilla Public License 2 is compatible with GPL2, LGPL 2.1, GPL3, and LGPL3 simply because it says so. If you take a look at the text of Mozilla Public License 2, you'll see a special provision that says exactly that. An MPL author can opt out of that compatibility, but they very rarely do so. The next principle is that the more conditions a license imposes, the less compatible it is. Copyleft licenses have more conditions, and permissive licenses have fewer conditions. The stronger a copyleft license is, the more conditions it imposes. If you want to know more about strong and weak copyleft licenses, you might like to take a look at my presentation on open source licensing basics. There's information about that at the end of this presentation. So let's see the end result. If you put all this together, this chart is the end result of compatibility. Now keep in mind that this table doesn't answer all compatibility questions by any means. There are many open source licenses other than those listed here. I have only listed the most common ones. Also, when we are talking about compatibility, we are talking about it in a limited sense. Can code under the license be put in a larger code base under another license? And finally, I've mentioned a Affero GPL on this slide, but not in the rest of the presentation. Affero GPL is the strongest copyleft license in common use, so obviously it's not compatible with any other license. If you would like to see more resources on this topic, again, take a look at my open source licensing basics presentation. If you want to know more about open source licensing generally, you might like to read my book, Open Source for Business. You can download a free copy by visiting my website, going to the Links tab, and following the instructions there. As I mentioned, I'm also a venture capitalist. OSS Capital specializes in early-stage investments in commercial open source businesses. That's it for this short presentation on compatibility. I hope you enjoyed it and found it useful. This is Heather Meeker, signing off.